Show your support. Like, share and subscribe.
Hello, I am That British Guy and welcome. I have been playing quite a lot of Metal Gear Solid 5 recently, and obviously this game had a fair few issues towards the end in terms of its story, but its gameplay still continues to be one of the best games I've ever played. And that transferred brilliantly over to Metal Gear Survive, obviously, because it was the same engine being used, but kind of took things off in a very stupid direction. I did play through the game in its entirety, but I am less inclined to go back to that game, although I have tried a couple of times. It's just much more enjoyable to go back to Metal Gear Solid 5 and some of the other games even older than that in the series. You may or may not know I did a complete playthrough of Metal Gear 2 using the Metal Gear Solid 3 disc, the kind of extra bit on the subsistence disc, and it still holds up today as probably one of the best 8-bit games and still a very playable and enjoyable game. So it kind of got me thinking, what could Konami do with this series other than Metal Gear Survive 2 or pachinko machine things or god-awful mobile games that will essentially kill the franchise and kill everybody's love of the franchise and the characters and the story going forward, and kind of make them spiral down this hole that they are kind of digging for themselves. So, in quite a break from tradition, I've decided to do a quick list of 5 things that I think Konami could do with varying levels of difficulty, but also with varying levels of success. So let's start off with number 5, and that would be to remake Metal Gear Solid 3. Now, we have seen that they have given it some attention because the cutscenes have been remade for their pachinko machines and look absolutely stunning. If they were to couple this with the gameplay seen on the Fox engine on Metal Gear Solid 5 and Metal Gear Survive, then that could really kind of iron out any of the gameplay issues that we saw in Metal Gear Solid 3, namely the having to kind of pause the immersion all the time and change your camouflage and change your face paint, healing yourself in various different menus because of gunshot wounds or poisons, things like that. It was kind of the main issue that many people had with that game when it came out. The story is still one of the best in the series, if not the best in the series, so Konami don't have to touch any of that. They don't even really have to re-record anything, they can just remaster the sound, because it was developed, about 13-14 years ago, so should still be okay with a bit of a high definition tweak. And if they can recreate the cutscenes as they have done, they've shown that they have done with the pachinko machine, and use the already made assets within the Fox engine, then doing kind of like-for-like levels in remaking the entire game would just make the whole thing a much better experience. It would look and sound a lot better on the PlayStation 4, and as I said, would just kind of iron out those issues around the menu. And I think a lot of gamers would welcome that, because it is still one of the most beloved games in the entire franchise. Number 4, remake Metal Gear 1 and 2. Now, this will be a lot bigger challenge. They would be unable to just kind of copy the game as is. There would need to be, especially on Metal Gear 1's side, a big fleshing out of the story, of the characters and their personalities and backstory. Obviously, it would be expected that the games would be voice cast as well, so they would need to kind of develop the dialogue and get that recorded. However, if they were able to do that, that would open up the game to an even bigger audience, especially outside of Japan, because the only people that have played the kind of proper version of the first two games that were released on the MSX in 1987 and 1990 were those that got hold of Metal Gear Solid 3 Subsistence and played the port versions on the second disc. Now, of course, the game itself would not kind of stand up against games as they exist today. Obviously, they were 2D kind of sprite-based pixelated games, so that would need addressing immediately. But there must be enough kind of renders of a lot of these characters or similar characters within their archive system where a little bit of tweaking, and I'm not saying that they have to kind of make this look as good as Metal Gear Solid 5, but it would be nice if they could. But if they released these two games as sort of one big game together, almost in kind of two acts, if you like, as a Metal Gear collection, then that would kind of get over the shortness of the game, so they wouldn't have to flower it out with too much fluff. But again, the main basis, the main characters of the game are already there for them. All they would need to do is kind of expand on this and feed it into what comes after it and before it in the chronology, which of course we all know now anyway, so they wouldn't have to kind of make up too much stuff around what already exists. Yes, it would be quite a bit more work than remaking Metal Gear Solid 3, but I think the reception that it would garner from the fan base would be more so, and they would probably be able to make more money out of selling more units of it, especially to those who have yet not played this game or either of these games at all via MGS3 Subsistence or the original releases on the MSX. Number 3, Metal Gear Rising 2. Now this one goes completely out to left field. This could quite easily be given to a third party team and just have Konami kind of oversee things. The Metal Gear Rising Revengeance game was kind of a huge breakaway from what we expected from the Metal Gear Solid franchise. There was less emphasis on the stealth mechanics and it was a lot more action based, and this could be repeated quite easily with Rising 2, and especially now that we have seen what happens to Raiden in Metal Gear Solid 2 and what he becomes in Metal Gear Solid 4. Why not revert back to what Metal Gear Rising was meant to be in the first place, and that is his story in between the two games. Now, I know this was a problem when Rising Revengeance kind of made its comeback and the developers wanted a bit more freedom over the storyline. However, I'm sure you could find a company that would be happy to take that on with the kind of restrictions that you get there, and we could kind of see the story as to not only how he became what we see as the cyborg ninja in Metal Gear Solid 4, but also it is kind of hinted heavily that he helped free Sonny from the Patriots, so we could go down that angle as well, and that would kind of play into the crazy wackiness of what the Patriots become in Metal Gear Solid 4, and that would go very well with the crazy gameplay elements that we saw in Metal Gear Rising. Not only this, Konami would not have to be as heavily involved in the game and just kind of oversee things from the outside, but they would still reap the benefits and rewards of this game, as they would still obviously be able to oversee everything and own the IP to the characters and the storyline. Now, the next two things are completely brand new. They're not based on old games that already exist or old concepts and ideas that started to be developed that then got kind of left at the wayside. Number 2, Metal Gear Philanthropy. Now, in the tanker mission in Metal Gear Solid 2, when you are controlling Snake and conversing with Otacon, it is explained that the two of them have created this organisation known as Philanthropy, and have been responsible for destroying and disabling many Metal Gear units throughout the world. Now, this chapter takes place in story terms 2 years after the events of Metal Gear Solid 1. So why not have a game where you play through as a much younger Solid Snake, the Solid Snake we were expecting to play as throughout the entirety of Metal Gear Solid 2, and why not tell that story of how Philanthropy got started and how they travelled the world disabling and destroying these Metal Gear units. There have been quite a few concepts of Metal Gear throughout the years that never got used in games. They could kind of make a bit of an appearance here, which is quite a nice little bit of fan service, acknowledging those kind of earlier models and earlier designs that got kind of put on ice. This game could also, because you are jumping from place to place, similar to how you do in Metal Gear Solid 4, this game could be released in episodic fashion. Now, I know that there will be people out there that would be very much against this, but we have seen through the likes of Life is Strange, the Minecraft story series, and to kind of go to a more AAA expectant type game, Hitman, and the soon-to-be released Hitman 2, that there is a time and a place for episodic games. And especially looking at Hitman 2, with the maps changing as they do with the different missions that you have to do, the episodic way of telling that story works really, really well. You're able to completely immerse yourself in that part of the story and that map within the game, and then once that has been kind of played to death, if you like, a new episode is released and it almost refreshes the game completely for the player. And obviously over 4 or 5, 6 different episodes, this happens with kind of greater intrigue and interest, and you can drip feed the story into the player because they are unable to kind of play beyond that episode until the next one is released. So instead of, as we saw in Metal Gear Solid 4, where you just kind of play through an area and then load up the next one, and you can never kind of go back to where you were in the story and play through, what you can have here is different episodes where you can kind of chop and change, go back to earlier episodes if you wish to play through those and collect other kind of items and bits of information that can then feed through into the next episode. What Konami can also do is use the feedback from, especially from a technical standpoint, from what happens in, say, episode 1, and kind of polish that a little bit more for episode 2, and hopefully improve on this as the episodes go on, patching that kind of back into episode 1 and 2 by the time we get to the end of the game. Now, I'm not a big fan of kind of patching out errors, but when you are developing games in this way, it's inevitable that that kind of thing would happen. And unfortunately, that is just part and parcel of AAA gaming now anyway. So we might as well use that gamer and user feedback and actually feed it back into the game and make improvements throughout it. And number 1, make Metal Gear 3. Now, just like Metal Gear Solid 3 was a prequel to Metal Gear Solid 1 and 2, and introducing us to playing as a character that we were familiar with but we had never played as before, why not do the same thing with Metal Gear 1 and 2? Let's have another prequel of those two games, so set before 1995 in the storyline, and let us play as a character that we are aware of but have not played as yet. And my suggestion for this is setting the game just after the Gulf War in the very early 90s, when Big Boss's command of Foxhound is still in its infancy, and before any of the events of Outer Heaven and Zanzibar Land that we see in Metal Gear 2. What we can also do is feed into and hopefully answer some of the issues in Metal Gear Solid 5, those unanswered bits of storyline, because it was meant to be the bridging the gap between Big Boss's story and Solid Snake's story, and we didn't quite get that in every possible aspect. However, with this game, why not play as Frank Jaeger, Grey Fox? We can see Big Boss and Solid Snake from a distance, as we did with Raiden in Metal Gear Solid 2, so we're able to get a different aspect of those characters. We are able to find out how Big Boss transfers from the man he was in 1984 in the Phantom Pain to becoming the commander of the Foxhound unit. We could even use this mission as a means of finding out how Frank Jaeger got the codename of Grey Fox. Why not start him out as more of a rookie than that in this game, and by the end of it he has developed into what we know as Grey Fox and what we are told he is by Metal Gear 1. We can also see how the Diamond Dogs unit gets kind of ingrained into Outer Heaven, and how Big Boss and Venom Snake create their plan for what will happen in Metal Gear 1 and Metal Gear 2, when we are then introduced to Solid Snake. Now, in Metal Gear Solid 1, there were a fair few mentionings of what happened during the Gulf War in terms of the Genome Soldiers. We can put clues and information regarding that in there as well, and depending on where we situate the story, we could quite easily use assets and landscape from Metal Gear Solid 5 and Metal Gear Survive to very quickly create this landscape and area, especially if it is based in kind of a Middle Eastern or African setting. I actually propose setting this on the Kuwait-Iraqi border, and we could also introduce kind of the development of the PFs that we saw in Metal Gear Solid 5 and the PMCs that we see in Metal Gear Solid 4. Why not bridge that gap here as well, with those kind of companies just starting to kind of really go global and really trying to exploit governments and other states in order to kind of get the wheels of the war economy in motion. Obviously, as we know as well, Zero is kind of in a vegetative state by now, so what has happened to Cypher? Is this now when it kind of branches into heavy AI Patriots territory? Is Sigint still involved in a heavy capacity, or have they kind of ousted him in any way? Potentially, what is Paramedic's role in this timeline? What is Ocelot up to? What is Eva up to? These kind of things can be either hinted at, addressed, answered, because there seemed to be a massive leap between Metal Gear Solid 3 and 4, and not all of those things were kind of considered properly in Peace Walker or Metal Gear Solid 5. So there we go, 5 ideas that I think Konami could pull off with varying levels of success and difficulty. Please let me know what you think of those ideas. If you have any of your own, please put them in the comments below and we can start a bit of a conversation regarding those. Until next time, I have been That British Guy, and I will see you very soon. Goodbye.